Segue, to continue at once with the next musical selection or composition.
Segue, to make a transition directly from one section or theme to another.
To move smoothly and unhesitatingly from one state, situation, condition, or element to another.
Segue, to perform in the manner of the preceding section.
Segue, to make a transition from one thing to another smoothly and without interruption.
This is Segue with Dean Aldemaro Romero, a weekly program exploring the lives and work of the people of the College of Arts and Sciences at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville.
Hello everybody. Dr. Margaret Peck Simons was born in Wyandotte, Michigan, and obtained her doctorate from Purdue University in Indiana. She was for many years a faculty member and the chair of the Department of Philosophy at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. Welcome to Segue, Dr. Simons.
Thank you.
Initially, I understand you wanted to be a medical doctor, but then you switched to philosophy. I wonder how that happened.
Oh, well, you know, in a funny way, it was my English comp class, my English 101 class at University of Michigan. The guy was a former priest. He showed off the big calluses on his knees one day in our class. I was from this big industrial arts high school outside of Detroit, and I never had much liberal education, you know. I just lived for dancing and music, and, you know, it was Motown ruled. It was a wonderful time, but, you know, I didn't study very much. So when I got to the University of Michigan, well, this guy gave an assignment, and it said we had to write a paper on liberal versus practical education. So I was sucking up the professor. I knew he believed in liberal education, so I wrote a paper on liberal education. And I convinced myself I was going to be a doctor because girls were not supposed to be doctors. And I was, you know, it was not a good reason to be a doctor.
But then you became interested in a woman whose path was quite unique in terms of his public persona, her own philosophy, her own outlook in life, and who became actually very famous, which was Simone de Beauvoir. And I was wondering if you can summarize for our audience, who was she?
Well, she was an important existentialist writer in post-war France. So her major fame, the period of her fame, was in the 1950s, post-war, late 40s, 50s, 60s, 1960s, the heyday of existentialism worldwide. And then she lived until the mid-80s. In the 70s, she became very active in the women's movement, and her name probably is best known for two different kinds of works. In 1949, she wrote a book called The Second Sex, which interested me because I became part of the women's liberation movement. I'm an old hippie, and in the, in the 60s, I was in the women's liberation movement at Purdue University when I was a graduate student. And she wrote this book, The Second Sex, that was very philosophically dense. It had a terrible translation, but you had to read it in French to get all the philosophy. But it was very intriguing and was sexual liberation, which I liked, of course, being a hippie, and a Marxist because it was anti-war era, anti-Vietnam War, so it was very timely in the 70s. And what was funny was she wrote it in 1949. I was very interested in how she wrote this, where this book came from. She was, at that time, maybe she was more well known for her autobiographies. She wrote a book, Memoirs of a Dutiful Daughter. She wrote a book about her mother's death, a very easy death that was wonderful. She's an award-winning novelist. She liked to write philosophy in novels and short stories. She wanted to bring the concrete reality to metaphysical reasoning. She didn't want to write something that was divorced from the emotions, and I think she felt it was part of sort of being a woman, was valuing this emotional side of her life, and she was raised very, very Catholic and struggled with this a romantic denial of women's subjectivity that she was taught as a child, and denial of her sexuality. And she became an important leader for a sexual liberation movement in the 50s. And I had no idea about that until recently when I was working on a volume of her feminist writings. I mean, in America, we don't think of feminists as sexual liberation leaders. And it was Hugh Hefner and the Playboy, and then there was this magazine Cosmopolitan that was Helen Gurley Brown, very much into sexual freedom, but she wanted women to use sex to get ahead in the system, and Simone de Beauvoir wanted to overturn the system.
Right. But were you surprised that she herself said that she wasn't a philosopher? Because, yes, you are a philosopher.
Oh, yeah, it was ridiculous. In her autobiographies, she told the story of her childhood and her early adulthood and later in life. And one theme was that she was not a philosopher. She was a literary writer. And the center of her life was a relationship with the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, the very famous existentialist. And he was the philosopher. And I remember reading that when I was a grad student, just getting started, and thinking, oh, well, of course she said that. It was before the women's liberation movement. I mean, she was just blending in with society. But she surely doesn't believe that. So I finished my coursework for my dissertation, for my doctorate at Purdue University, and the head of my department said, Peg, have you thought of applying for a Fulbright to study in Europe to do your dissertation? And I said, study in Europe? Do you mean in Germany with Habermas? And he looked at me and he said, no, in Paris with Simone de Beauvoir. And I said, but is she a philosopher? and he was so encouraging, this man that was head of the department, that I decided to try. So I wrote her a letter in Paris, and I contacted people who knew her. Kate Millett was a women's liberation leader and author of a book called Sexual Politics. I contacted Kate Millett. So then she offered to write Beauvoir a letter. And then Calvin Schrag was the name of the chair of my department. He wrote a letter. And then I found someone else to write a letter. But before she even got the letter, she sent a letter back to me saying that she would be glad to, she gave me the words that I needed for the Fulbright. She said, I would be glad to meet with you to supervise your studies during the course of that next academic year. Yeah. I was stunned, and I thought, because my proposal was to study her philosophy outside of the context of Sartre. She was seen as Sartre's mistress, Sartre's girlfriend, Sartre's philosophical follower. And I thought, oh, well, of course, she doesn't believe that, really. That's just what she says. So I proposed to study her as you would study a regular philosopher. Look at the different things that she'd been reading, look for the themes that were in her work. And she wrote back and said, yes, she'd be glad to meet with me.
Now, she evolved in many ways, because my understanding is, as a child, she was a very religious person who even considered to become a nun, and then went all the way to become an atheist.
Well, I don't think that's that hard to pull off. I mean, I'm married to a lapsed Catholic. He said to me that one day he broke the Mr. Potato Man in his childhood, and he prayed all night for God to restore that toy. And he woke up and that toy was not restored, and that was it.
Okay, that was proof.
Moving right along.
Another thing I read about her is that her father once commented when she was a child is that she thought like a man. Yes. And do you think he got that impression because she felt she tried to liberate herself, and therefore she didn't comply with the female stereotype?
Well, you said, did she liberate herself? You know, really, if you look at a bigger social historical context, you see that in France, after World War I, the country was decimated. The men were gone. There was a great worry about demographics. They wanted to have the population come back. There was a big force to have women have children, but there were no men for these women to marry. And her grandfather, her mother's father, she had been very wealthy, had been ruined in World War I. He had invested in Russian bonds. Well, goodbye. Yeah. Right. So, and had been caught up in a scandal and had been actually in prison for a little while. So her family was bankrupt. And her father, who had great aristocratic pretensions, de Beauvoir, Simone de Beauvoir, with this little handle to her name, he saw a great tragedy. He said, my daughters must prepare for careers because they will not have a dowry. If you didn't have a dowry, you couldn't make a bourgeois marriage. You couldn't have an arranged marriage. In the class that he saw himself in the class that she was supposedly in, there was really no future for her. So when you said she liberated herself, really, you could say that she exploited an advantage, an opportunity that was opened up to her because of the crisis of wartime. I mean, a lot of women are brilliant, and without the opportunity, there they are in a farm in, you know, in the frontier in Montana, and, you know.
Yeah. Well, you know, while reading about Simone de Beauvoir and reading about you, I did find a parallelism between the two of you.
Did you?
Simone basically was one of the first women admitted at La Sorbonne.
She was.
Okay. And you were the first woman admitted at the doctoral program in philosophy at Purdue.
That's true.
So I wonder if somehow you had even a subconscious bridge being created about these two parallel lives in certain ways.
It wasn't. I'm sure it was in my unconscious but I think that it was the historical parallels. If you think about it, that I'm a hippie. I was the first generation of women to have birth control. You couldn't get birth control pills as a single unmarried woman until 1968 or so. I remember trying. And so there was a sexual liberation movement. Well, she came of age, and I was the first woman admitted into the graduate program in philosophy at Purdue. Well, she benefited from decades and decades of fight by French feminists to get women into universities. And I mean, there was a time when they had a complete different curricula. Women followed, girls followed end of studies exam they took that led to no career and no schooling, and it was only in 1924 that was changed. She graduated in 1925, so she became eligible to go right on, the first generation of women eligible to pursue the agrégation in philosophy. I mean, you could have done it in literary studies, but so I'm sure there was this sense of kindred spirit with her, and she wrote this book, The Second Sex, in 49, and I think it was this burst of enthusiasm and idealism that followed the end of World War II. Well, I was coming of age at the end of the Vietnam War and a huge anti-war movement. Well, she was part of she was the heir of the idealism of a resistance movement. There was a broad leftist coalition resistance government in France right after the war. It crumbled. But she wrote that in this moment of idealism, and I really entered in graduate school and got first started in another moment of idealism. So we were a lot alike historically.
Yeah. Okay. Now, she never married. She never had children.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you don't have those experiences, somehow if that changes your views on feminism, because obviously there are many women who are married and have children are consider themselves feminists. But I wonder if not having those experiences give you a different perspective.
Well, I bet. I mean, in a sense, your ideas are going to flow from what you've experienced. So I don't have any children. I'm married, but I don't have any children, and that was a choice. My mother was what they called a career woman. Well, it was the days before they had daycare centers. Mm-hmm. It was very hard for her to find childcare. Mm-hmm. And I took care of my younger sister and realized how hard that was. And I can hardly find time to change the cat litter. You know, I had no illusions. And I'm very sympathetic now to women of this much younger generation who are determined to have children along with having a job. But boy, you must realize that yourself. It's difficult to move these institutions that were founded on a model of an individual male who didn't have those responsibilities. I mean, it's very difficult. So a lot of people responded to Beauvoir very positively, even though you'd think they might be really opposed to each other, because she wanted liberation and equality for women. And what woman doesn't want that? I mean, I read this thing in the paper the other day that they're resuscitating this ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. I thought that was dead in the water. Yeah. I mean, the idea that women, I mean, they have to have jobs, and they want to have
Equal
equality,
pay.
right? Equal
Yeah.
pay and equal opportunities,
Yeah.
and it ain't easy when you got a family.
No. Well, even we are having trouble trying to convince some people to increase the minimum wage. Imagine
I
going through
know.
that. Another aspect of the personal life of Simone de Beauvoir, which I was wondering whether or not that may have an impact on her views on feminism, is the fact that she had many lovers of both sexes.
Yeah.
Do you think that's part of her sense of liberation, meaning I can do anything I want within that part of my life, or was something pretty normal for her?
Well, in a sense, she was an heir to the 19th century tradition of women having a culture among themselves. So she was raised she attended a Catholic girls' school. There were never any boys there. 19th century was very separate spheres. So you have women in one sphere and men in another. And these female friendships, this intense emotionality, that's what was encouraged. And we had that kind of in the States too, where you had women were the moral leaders. Women were supposed to, the heart was in the home, and that's where women were supposed to be. And men, there was no room for morality in cutthroat capitalism. So you had these separate spheres. So in a sense, those intense emotional, and for her, sexual relationships grew out of really kind of a 19th century experience. But she denied all of that. She denied the philosophy, and she denied those sexual relationships with women. And by God, she continued to deny her work in philosophy after I met her. When I went to Paris, my first interview with her, I said, "So, Simone de Beauvoir, here I am for my doctoral dissertation work on the second sex. Tell me about this. You've been reading. An important influence on the second sex was a book by Kojève on Hegel, right? And she got mad. She banged her fist on her coffee table, a meeting in her apartment, and she said, "No, mademoiselle. The only philosophical influence on the second sex was Being and Nothingness by Jean-Paul Sartre." And I thought, oh my God, I sold my books for this. I sold my car. I was just flabbergasted. She never, in all the years I met with her, and I met with her probably a dozen times over until she died in '86, she never would answer a question from me about her philosophy in the second sex. Never.
That's interesting.
Oh, it was horrible. Imagine.
Now that you mentioned Jean-Paul Sartre, which is one of the most famous French philosophers of all times, they were lovers, but it seems to me that a lot of the stories that were published in the media in the 60s about her and Sartre maybe had a different standards for women that they had today. For example, all these stories, not only about her sexuality, but, for example, having relationship with her students and then passing her students to Jean-Paul Sartre. There was a lot of that in the media, despite the fact that we're talking about the 60s in a French, more liberal environment. And I wonder if today women philosophers who have a more out of the mainstream views about different aspects of life, whether it is feminism or sexuality, whatever it may be, have to go through the same scrutiny as she went through.
Oh, that's interesting. I don't know if that's true or not. I'm not really in the limelight. I don't have much scrutiny. I'm pretty conventional in my life, so I haven't confronted that much. But, morals have changed. I was thinking of national leaders, and like John F. Kennedy. We didn't really, at the time, read about his affair with Marilyn Monroe or all these women and stuff. I don't know. But now the press loves to expose these things. And the French leaders, the male leaders, they're in this scandal about the affairs these guys are having. For Simone de Beauvoir, I think this morality of having sexual relationships with your students, that was so common when I was coming of age. I mean, that's what you did. You asked people who they married, and lots of women married their teachers. I mean, that was a way for a teacher to find a girlfriend, a future wife. My sister's husband said, "Oh, you're going for your MRS degree? saying that I'm going to seduce somebody and marry them, and that's why I was going to grad school. Oh boy! So it's in a way that's an old-fashioned view that a woman's whole goal is to get married, but that whole practice of having sex with your students is still not gone. And is more problematic. And people will say, well, I did fine. It didn't hurt me. I came out of it just fine. You talk to women who had those relationships. But when you have someone in so much power, not just in their age and their sophistication, but when they have power over you, it's not a good relationship. And Beauvoir, I have to say, when she had sexual relationships with those girls, they were like 18, 17, 18, they were no longer her students. She did not have relationships with someone in her class, as that I've been able to find. I mean, I read all her diaries, and they tell everything. She and Sartre wrote everything in their letters. So if you want to read all that stuff, you're welcome to read their letters. They've all been published.
Talk about her diaries. She wrote some diaries about her trips to the United States.
Yeah, she did.
And I was wondering if you can summarize to our audience, what was her views of this country at her time?
That it represented freedom, and I mean, America liberated France. I mean, if you were living in a town on Normandy that was destroyed, you have mixed feelings. But she saw France. I mean, America was this wonderful, exciting place, and New York. Oh my God, New York! There was this huge attraction, and yet when she got there, it was on the dawn of the McCarthy era. It was the Cold War was starting. Yes. She was appalled by the anti-communism, and she was appalled by the expectation that World War III was around the corner. She couldn't believe it. They were talking about nuking Russia or something. I mean, she couldn't believe the kind of right-wing politics that she came across when she was here. But one of the things that was the centerpiece of her book called America Day by Day, which is a travelogue taken from her diary about her trip to America in 1947. So it was just before writing the second sex. She had just begun writing it, published in 1949, was her meeting with Richard Wright. Richard Wright, an African-American writer, a novelist who then emigrated to France, had terrible experiences, you can imagine. I think the last one was a waitress salting his coffee when he was at a delicatessen in New York. I mean, he just had it. You hear Ferguson with all the terrible things people put up with. He had just had it. So he emigrated to France, and she met him, and she and Sartre published Richard Wright's short stories, essays in their journal right in the beginning of the post-war period. Anyway, he was her guide in Harlem, and then he was her intellectual guide to understanding about the black experience in America. She had this romantic view of blacks, the best jazz and the most soulful, the romantic view. And another side of her had this view that there is no such thing as race. We are only humans, and race is nothing, and she would get mad when people would talk about racial differences. So between this kind of romanticization on one hand and this denial of difference and humanism on another, she had her intellectual hands full when she took a Greyhound bus trip through the South and encountered horrible segregation, terrible practices, and wrote about them in this book.
I think a lot of Americans don't realize that many foreigners have this ideal view of America as a very liberal place until they come here and realize it's really a very conservative society. And what you explain about her sounds to go through that kind of experience.
Yes, she learned about the country. She found a lover. They always say that a man would go to a country and find a lover, and it's the way to learn about a country. Well, she found lovers in America, and her American lover, Nelson Algren, was a famous, they called a Chicago school writer. I think A Man with a Golden Arm. He talked about drug addicts, and he gave her a tour of those horrible dives in Chicago. She was enchanted. She thought it was wonderful. She liked the seamy side. But she wanted to find out a lot about America, and it's like you said. There's this puritanical tradition. America has church-based. I mean, there's this born-again Christianity that's popular. It was not at all popular in France, of course. I mean, at the time. So yes, I think they're very surprised. She was very shocked at the attitude about the coming war.
Now, after your retirement from Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, you have continued some activities in your area. And I want you to explain that to us in the few minutes that we have left and show through the people who are watching this through the webcam what that was all about.
Let me see if I can hold this up.
There you go. So tell us about that particular initiative in the last 2 minutes that we have.
This is called Diverse Lineages of Existentialism. It grew in a way out of my interest in Richard Wright and his influence on Simone de Beauvoir. I thought that she got an understanding of racial difference that she used in her analysis of gender difference and gender oppression in the second sex. So I did a lot of research on him some 25 years ago. So I organized a conference to really encourage people to take up, we have 7-volume series at University of Illinois Press, and her diaries and a lot of her texts. The new volume that's just coming out is on feminist writings and should be out in March of 2015. And I wanted to sort of encourage people to do the research, to not, I didn't know how to do it, so I thought, well, invite them to come here and talk about it. Yeah. So I thought, well, I don't want just a group of feminists or French. I really wanted people working on Richard Wright as well, and I started thinking how to do that. And I found this wonderful organization, the Caribbean Philosophical Association, and Lewis Gordon, who's this brilliant theorist from Jamaica. It's just fantastic. And he agreed to be the keynote, and I got a bunch of other organizations, the North American Sartre Society, of course, with the Simone de Beauvoir Society, don't you think? And then their mutual friend, the Merleau-Ponty Society. So we had a time of our life. It was absolutely wonderful. We had it at the Hyatt Regency at the Arch. There were over 200 participants presenting papers over 3 days or so. It was marvelous. And we have it on the website still. If they go to SIUE, Existentialism. If someone's interested, they can find all the details and photographs. And thank you so much for your support. That was really sweet of you to back it with the Cuban and Caribbean Center in the CAS. I really appreciated that support.
It's my pleasure, because I thought it was a great idea. And as you can see from this conversation, I have enjoyed a lot talking about these very issues. So, well, thank you very much to Professor Peg Simons for this interesting conversation about existentialism and Simone de Beauvoir and many other things. And next week, we're going to have Professor Garrett Schmidt of the Department of Music at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, who will be talking about the secrets of a jazz trumpet player. So stay tuned.
This has been Segue with Dean Aldemaro Romero, a production of the Department of Mass Communications at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. All rights reserved, 2014.